Welcome back. I'm here to read more of Twisted Confessions by Bryan Bloom and a murder mystery. And I'm going to start or continue with chapter 9 and I'll read chapter 10. And then I'm going to save chapter 11 that's a little bit longer and has a little bit more graphics that I want to speak to and gets into the financial stuff too. So, with no further ado, here we go. Chapter 9. It's Wednesday, 11:30 a.m. Detective Whittier watched as Professor Edmonton pulled himself up into his red Chevy pickup truck. Not the type of vehicle I expected him to drive, he said to himself, as his gaze zeroed in on the license plate, locking the numbers in place in his head. He pulled out behind the truck, keeping a safe and unobvious distance. Since he saw Dwyer Edmonton at the Twisted Vine yesterday morning, the man stuck out in his mind like a sore thumb, and he tracked down his home address, hoping to do a little trailing behind him. While his truck wasn't a direct reflection of how the man presented himself in the world, his house was. Located in the heart of Twisted Straits, the small condo was walking distance from the downtown shops, and with a brightly colored lime green door that gave off an artsy vibe. Chris navigated his way slowly down the one way through the town center. Barbara Bishop waved a hand in his direction, her eyebrows raised in an all knowing manner, just as his phone buzzed to life. An unknown number calling him at such an inopportune time. Detective Whittier. Hi, Detective. This is Ross Jackson. You interviewed me about Jane Lawrence's murder a couple days ago. Hi. Yes, Ross. How could he forget the saddest interviewee of all? Gearing up for some good tidbits of information, Chris raised his eyebrows to no one but himself. What can I do for you? Without hesitation, Ross's voice came through the line, rattled with nerves. Stephen Eilson is missing. The words were mashed together like a tower of Legos clicked into place. I'm sorry, but can you elaborate? Chris kept his voice steady, his gaze on the Chevy, maintaining an acceptable distance. I've tried to call him a dozen times in text and, well, no response. How long have you tried? Have you gone to his house? Contacted his wife? Well, no, but it's just very unlike him to not answer. The guy always answers or responds within seconds. And it's been like 12 hours since I've tried. Mr. Jackson, I understand your concern, but our department doesn't really file a missing persons report until the person has been gone for 24 hours. Can you confirm Stephen has been missing for 24 hours? Well, no, but I suggest you speak with one of Stephen's family members about your concern and then get back to me. Ross hesitated and responded, Okay, thank you, and I'm sorry to bother you, Detective. No problem. Chris had a growing empathy for Ross Jackson, and he wasn't sure where it came from. Willie Nelson's storytelling lyrics serenaded Detective Whittier as he followed the professor along the state road. What exactly was taking the professor out of town? Questions twisted through Chris's head as he trekked along for another 20 minutes, turning off at the exit he only ever used when he went hunting with his father or with his brother. This part of the state didn't have much to show for except endless rows of corn and rundown homes that dotted the roadside every couple of miles. Even the gas station looked like something from a Stephen King movie, desolate and frequented by downtrodden characters that moved through life like they were trapped in molasses. The professor stopped at an intersection that held the gas station, a lonely bus stop, and an unmanned farm stand selling a sparse selection of gourds. Even though he was the only other vehicle on the road, Chris kept his distance and moved his gaze all around the intersection, hoping the professor wouldn't see how much he did not fit the mold of a local resident. Act normal. You're just a regular person passing through this dead town. His heartbeat picked up pace when he accidentally locked eyes with the professor, who was now staring at him in the rearview mirror. He's on to me. When the light finally turned green, Chris turned right, hoping to throw off the professor and relying on his talent for having a good sense of directions. He sped up and took the next left, coming to the end of the road just as the red pickup truck passed by. Phew! He stepped on the gas gently while easing back into ever so slightly, following from a distance and committing the professor's next turn to memory. The top of a church steeple reached for the sky, peeking out from clusters of red and orange leaves. The red truck turned in front of a sign with a random blend of black letters that greeted the side of the road. Chris pulled into the next dip off the main road, a gravelly pathway more meant for feet than tires. To his right, he had a clear shot of where the professor was parking in the church lot. He rolled down his window, hoping to ingest some of the words that were now being exchanged between the professor and a couple who emerged from a silver car. They all shook hands and walked in the direction of a small brick building that was attached to the white church. What is this guy up to? Chris spoke to himself, feeling as if he was getting involved in something that was much shadier than he had assumed. An empty church in a podunk town 30 minutes away from Twisted Straits. Why was this strange group encounter so private? Once they were out of sight, Chris stepped out of his car, the question in his mind, circling from much like the tumbleweed that was now spinning in clumps at his feet. Patting his side to make sure his gun was secure, he marched towards the brick building, his head on a swivel the entire time. He had to admit that he was in his element. Unlocking clues and clicking the puzzle pieces into place was what he lived for in this job, and he longed for the feeling of satisfaction when he netted the killer. Another vehicle pulled into the lot and slipped between two pine trees, the needles batting him in the eye as he watched the figure of a young man stepping out of his car and approaching the building. As someone who had paid attention to people's gaits, Chris was certain he had seen the fast-paced march before, how the body angled forward at the shoulders ever so slightly, showcasing poor posture, as if his upper body was in a race with his lower body to get to a destination. Those slouched shoulders would have never been approved by drill instructors in the Marine Corps. Just as the man tore his hat off before entering the building, Chris recognized the thick head of dark hair that was perfectly placed with what appeared to be some type of hair glue. The guy that everyone called Sibo, the passionate student that stood front and center in Chris's mind as a suspect. He couldn't yet pinpoint why, but he was on a mission to find out. Chris kept his body pressed to the building, cheeks to the cold brick, and maneuvered his way to a window that sat unevenly spaced on the side that greeted a small plot of dead grass perpendicular to the parking lot. He was concealed from the incoming guests, and the crack in the clouded window would make it hard for anyone on the inside to have a clear shot of him. It also helped that the group was starting to gather and face the side wall, where a podium was centered in front of 3 rows of chairs that were filled with a random blend of people. An older couple held hands and looked ahead silently as if they were about to watch an execution. A few single middle-aged stragglers, some with arms crossed and looks of determination held on their faces, and others who appeared to be making small talk with one another. Professor Edmonton sat beside Sibo in the front row, alongside another man who had familiar characteristics that Chris couldn't quite pinpoint. The one thing all these people did have in common was that the book that they had in their hands or on their laps. a blue cover with a title that Chris couldn't make out. The only thing he could decipher was the hand reaching outward, holding on an open book when someone stood at the podium, holding the paperback up high. In response to the greeting, the guests opened their books to a designated page, as if they were seated in a row of pews reading from the gospel. Did I drive all this way for a book club meeting? The voice that called the room to attention was muffled behind the window, but Chris could detect what was happening, especially when the speaker started waving his hands around animately. The words that stood out among the rest, louder and angled with extreme passion, was the statement, "Think outside the box." Chris didn't know what this was followed up by, but he was finally able to get a glimpse of part of the book title, thanks to the woman on an end seat, who was holding it so close to her face that she disappeared within the book. He made out the words, "Confessions of a CPA," in bold black ink on the cover, and thanked the 2020 vision that earned him sharpshooter status in the Marine Corps. Chris kicked a section of rocks that were embedded into the grassy dirt area beneath his feet, loosening up some stones with the tip of his black boot. A CPA book club? He shook his head, aggravated by the realization that he was more confused now than when he arrived. Pressing his nose to the window once again, he took in the scene. Professor Edmonton was now standing at the podium reading from a chapter. He raised both hands in the air as if he was preaching to the gods and stepped backwards toward a marker board that clung to the wall crookedly behind him. With a bright red marker, he went to work writing out equations, the board swinging beneath his rough movements. Chris slipped his cell phone from his front jacket pocket, angled the camera and toward the board, and snapped a photo of the image that the group was now discussing. An underground book club that meets about a CPA book and does equations. Chris couldn't fathom the purpose of this, and if it had anything to do with the murder of Jane Lawrence. But the one thing he did know was that math never lied, and this group was putting up equations that Chris was determined to answer. Beneath the equation, the professor drew an impressive square with a brain shooting fireworks out of it in all directions. Beneath the artwork, he wrote the letters TOTB. It didn't take long for Chris to figure out what this stood for. Thanks to the artistic professor's talent at drawing. Think outside the box, Chris whispered to himself, knowing exactly what he had to do next. Chapter 10, Wednesday, 1 p.m. A blast of hot air hit Chris as he pushed through the Twisted Words bookstore. The rare, warm November day hadn't convinced the local shop owner to turn down the heat. The reason likely had something to do with the gaggle of older women seated in a circle in the corner of the store, Afghans on their laps and knitting needles poised to perfection, twisting in and out of the red and green yarn. Chris thought about his own grandmother and how he had always had the heat turned up full blast, well into the spring months. The ring of women kept up their conversations about what they were purchasing their grandchildren for Christmas, not noticing as Chris slipped into the narrow space between two shelves of books titled Nonfiction. He ran his finger along the paperback, stopping at every cover with a blue spine and pulling it out slightly to read the title. When he finally landed on one that was the same color as what he saw held up proudly in the meeting, he pulled it off the shelf and held it face up in his palms. Confessions of a CPA. Why what I was taught to be true turned out not to be. Bingo! He said the word too loud, and within seconds, an older woman was standing beside him. I'm so sorry, young man. I didn't even see you come in. I was so wrapped up in the Wednesday morning knitting club. The title, young man, didn't go unnoticed on Chris, especially since his sister in law had been lecturing him on how he was getting too old for the dating scene, something he had been intentionally steering clear of. But I trust that you have found what you are looking for. The woman rubbed her hands on the red apron he was wearing, an odd piece of attire to wear to work in a bookstore. Beatrice was written in the cursive purple on a paper name tag that was pinned to the upper left corner of her apron. Ah, you must be part of the club. She used a knobby finger to, to tap the cover of the book, stepping in closer to Chris as if she was about to tell a secret. Before he could act dumb about his alleged club, he paused and thought like a detective. Yes, I am. He held up the book, and I missed the most recent meeting, so I've got some homework to do. Do you happen to know when their next meeting is? Oh, I'm sorry, I can't help you there. They no longer meet here. Beatrice placed her hands on her hips, disappointment settling on her face. I was actually sad to see them go. I quite looked forward to their weekly meetings here. But we're a small shop, and they grew in size and moved elsewhere. She stared off over Chris's shoulder. It happens more often than I'd like. Clubs get bigger, they outgrow our little space here and move on to bigger bookstores or conference rooms. Beatrice looked around the room as if she was speaking about somebody who had died. But I'm sure you don't want to hear the history of the declining local bookstores, so I'll check you out at the register. I'm sorry to hear that. Chris followed Beatrice's slow steps, took in her perfectly coiffed gray hair that resembled his own grandmother's. She maneuvered herself between a small bookcase that held works by local authors and a shelf that had an array of trinkets. Wobbly headed animals darted their moving eyes, and a row of birds' nests held fake blue eggs and colorfully feathered birds. Centered among them all was a pewter business card holder that held a stack of twisted words cards with Beatrice's name and the phone number of the store. Beatrice scanned the book and paused. Wait a minute. Let me make sure this is the new edition. I know this author recently updated his material, so I want to make sure you get the latest and greatest. She punched in a few keys on her computer and transformed her face into a relieved expression. Yes, this is the new edition. I remember the older one was The Color of Money, hence the topic. She winked at Chris as if they were in on a little secret. After Chris paid for the book, Beatrice's cheeks turned red in embarrassment. Oh, I almost forgot to offer you a slice of my chocolate chip pumpkin bread. She bent over and retrieved a pumpkin shaped platter of bread coated in powdered sugar. And that answered his question about why the woman was wearing an apron. She held the tray, eager for him to take a slice, and he knew he wouldn't be able to leave the store without taking a bite and showing his approval. With two fingers, he pulled an oversized slice from the tray and bit into the corner, while simultaneously holding a thumb up with his other hand and making a big show of the delight his taste buds were experiencing. This is delicious. Beatrice clasped her free hand to her chest. Oh, thank you. I'm so glad you like it. I tried to add a little personal touch to the store. Maybe that will get people to make the trip here instead of staying in and ordering on Amazon. With all this online shopping, human contact is diminishing by the second, and I'm a firm believer we need friends. Friends that we can hug and talk with face to face. Well, I know that I've definitely come back for this bread and your selection of books. Chris tucked the receipt into the book and held it up. Speaking of, how many people did the club have in it when it first started here? Oh, it was actually just two men. They quite kept to themselves, and truth be told, I don't remember their names. Beatrice set the tray down on the counter and pointed a finger. I do know that I didn't always agree with what they talked about. You know, it's hard not to hear things when not a lot of people come into the shop and it's pretty close quarters in here. Really? Chris's natural curiosity seeped into the question, hoping it would spur the woman to share more. I'm a very traditional kind of woman and a firm believer in getting out of debt. As a business owner, you learn things like this. And let me tell you, I've learned quite a bit from my grandson. He went to school for finance and he set my husband and I up with a solid savings plan. My husband's 401k is sitting pretty for when we retire, or shall I say, when I decide to give up the store. She crumpled her pale eyebrows together. I did overhear those men talking about future taxes and how they'll probably be going up, which it could be really bad. We're not paying taxes on the 401k now, which I think is pretty darn good. Kind of makes me question the whole thing, to be honest with you. She looked around the shop, her gaze scanning the rows of cluttered bookstores, bookcases, with a sadness that pierced Chris's heart. He had a soft spot for the older women, having basically been raised by his grandmother. I'm new to the club, so I'm just learning all of this, but I certainly appreciate your honesty. Well, sometimes you got to find things out for yourself. Beatrice pressed her hands to the counter and passed Chris a warm smile. Oh, I'm so rude. Would you like to take a piece home for your wife? Oh, no, thank you. It's just me. The sadness in those words were emphasized by Beatrice's response. Oh, okay. Well, when you do meet that lucky young woman, you bring her in here for my bread, okay? Will do. Chris gave Beatrice a hearty smile and made his way to the door, stopping at the bulletin board that hung eye level on the wall. He leaned in and lifted a notice about the candlelight vigil for Jane and read the flyer beneath. Do you want to learn the truth about money? Sick of being charged unnecessary fees? It's time to think outside the box. Join the Financial Truth Club for a meeting that tackles the traditions of financial management. December 12th, 2021, 7 p.m., Twisted Words Bookstore. Chris was in luck that Beatrice rarely, if ever, changed out the flyers on the board. He turned to her back facing him as she had he turned to see her back facing him as he animately chatted with the group of knitters. And he pulled the push pin out of the two flyers, taking the bottom one and shoving it in his pocket. A year overdue, but this may lead to some answers. So that's the end of chapter 10. I just want to make a note, very simple, is she was, Beatrice was happy with the advice that she's received from her grandson with this probably a degree in finance and helped direct some of the choices made in their 401k. And 401k is being utilized pre-tax dollars. So there will be taxes someday down the road. And if taxes go up, right, you don't know what that amount that you're going to owe is, right? But you, in a 401k, you've gone into the jurisdiction of the government where they're going to decide the rules of the game or the tax rates when you may need to start accessing the money. So you have to start taking some of the distributions, but you don't know how much they're going to take. You know what it is today, but you don't know what it is in the future. And that is not something that I advocate. I advocate that you pay the taxes now, knowing what those rates are, and letting that seed of investment money post-tax grow into tax-free cash flow in your later years. So she felt good about not paying the taxes now, but she said, um, I did overhear those men talking about future taxes and how they probably go up, will probably go up, which could be really bad. Um, Kind of makes me question the whole thing, to be honest with you. So on one side, she's feeling good because they're not paying the taxes right now. They're seeing this money maybe grow. Um, but she's questioning it because she knows there is a day of reckoning where they're gonna to try to have access to the money, they're gonna have to pay taxes and not knowing what that's gonna be, what that rate's gonna be. So thanks for listening, and I'll keep on doing this. Thanks. Bye.